Professor, líderes, nosso presidente da ANPOCS, me pediu para eu apresentar a professora Brackette, que é a nossa conferencista de hoje à noite. Eu vou fazer uma apresentação muito breve, porque eu tenho certeza que vários de vocês já conhecem textos como Brackette. Brackette no presente é professora do Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade do Arizona, nos Estados Unidos, e ela veio ao Brasil graças a um convite do Programa de Pós-Graduação de Antropologia Social da Universidade de Brasília, onde ela proferiu duas palestras no Seminário Internacional na semana passada, e ela está aqui conosco na ANPOCS. A Brackette ganhou o prêmio da Fundação John D. MacArthur, que é um prêmio muito importante nos Estados Unidos. Nos Estados Unidos costuma se chamar esse ano de Genius Award, o prêmio dos gênios, um prêmio também financeiramente substancial, mas é um prestígio extremamente grande para aqueles acadêmicos e intelectuais que ganham esse prêmio. A Brackette ganhou esse prêmio em 1997. Ela tem uma série de atividades como editora, talvez se interesse mais para nós hoje, que tem a ver com os temas que ela vai tocar na conferência dela. Ela foi editora de 97 a 2000 da série Antropologia da Vida Cotidiana nos Estados Unidos, na editora Parte. A Brackette também foi presidente da. Eu estou apenas selecionando alguns títulos do livro lugar. Também foi presidente da Society for Cultural Evolvement, Sociedade para a Antropologia Cultural, que é uma das seções mais ativas da Associação Americana de Antropologia, e que tem certamente feito um dos trabalhos mais interessantes dentro da Associação Americana. Brackette foi professora em muitas universidades nos Estados Unidos, destacando apenas a Universidade da Califórnia em Los Angeles, a Universidade de Chicago, o Johns Hopkins University, New School of Social Research, City University of New York, entre várias outras. Brackette tem vários livros e artigos escritos sobre seus principais temas de estudo que envolvem a política cultural na região do Caribe e na Univ, e também a cognição e classificação nos Estados Unidos. Eu tenho imensa satisfação de passar a palavra para a Brackette, que foi uma das pessoas que eu convivi bastante quando fazia doutorado nos Estados Unidos, então também a Brackette já há mais de 20 anos, e é muito bom ver ela aqui conosco, e agradecer mais uma vez a sua disponibilidade. Brackette.
Hello. I'll turn it on. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Portuguese is truly a marvelous language, and I am regretting that I do not speak it because Gustavo told me what he was going to say before he got up here. He said he was going to say, "She is my friend," and sit down. It took him a rather long time to say that. So he understood something. Okay. I want to say a little bit about why I did the project from which this talk comes, even though this talk is not about that project per se. When I received a grant that do exactly what I wanted to do, I decided that being suicidal, I would study death. But I wasn't really interested in death. I was interested in thought about killing. So I decided to study classifying and kill. I brought together the two things that I intellectually like most. The predatory power of classification, its ability to produce categories that set people up for death and walk them through the process from life to death, and sometimes back to life. You know, you can rise up in proper categories. And so I was already at odds with my informants before I ever made it to the field, because they were genuinely concerned about death and killing. I was not unconcerned about that. I was only concerned about how they could express their concerns about that and what categories and concepts they were going to use and what abuse they were going to visit upon those concepts. So the book that I am writing about the death penalty is an ethnography of concepts and categories. It is about the life and death of concepts and categories. As a result, that is in part what this talk is about tonight, except that it is about also the ways in which two kinds of visions get caught in the competitive field of classification. The first of these visions are constitutional visions, by which I mean state constitution in terms of nation state, or jurisdictional constitutions, as in the United States having Arizona as one of its states, Arizona has a constitution. These represent the vision. I'm beginning to feel like throwing cricket here. It's okay. It's all right. So constitutional vision supposedly inscribes a people's ideas about how they're going to make life for themselves, their image, their vision of how to be a people together. International conventions, particularly human rights conventions, become either a supplement or a competitive vision for how to be human in any kind of society. So I became interested as I followed around my death penalty abolitionist people, and they made common cause with other human rights organizations in how they used classification first to discipline one another. And I'm going to leave their story to the side and look at how they discipline other people with classification and what that means for the ways in which constitutional visions must be adjusted to international conventions, and the way in which a particular mode of classification makes some states, particularly the weak states, the least powerful of the states, barbarians by being outliers to a particular mode of classification. I mean, they're not doing things the way they're supposed to do in the version. They don't have the right categories, they're not using the right concepts. If they have the right categories and concepts, they're not putting them into the proper structure. They're not organizing them properly. Now, states then can adjust their vision of how they're going to be as a people by amending their constitution. And if they have the power to do so, they can ward off involvement with international conventions by sticking to their constitutional vision and only modifying it by amendment even when they please. Otherwise, they face situations in which those who have very good intentions often think that they ought to make the law of the land, their constitution, consistent with whatever human rights convention they promote. Now, in and of itself, that's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing. Well, I suppose for some people it's a good thing. But I'm interested not in what, but how they try to make these things come together. And in that, I accuse them of imperial disciplinary practices, because all humans must classify. It's one of those things that you cannot get out of. You will produce a category, you will produce a concept, you will order it in some way. And you'll do that before the Army gets up and does all those things that it claims it can do before 7 o'clock in the morning. You will have done a million classifications before you eat your breakfast. In fact, Mary Douglas has already told us you can't eat your breakfast and know you're eating your breakfast without it being part of the classification system. So I'm not against classification. It is, as Alpha and Star would say, human to classify. What I will say, however, it is not human to insist that formal classification schemes are the only or even the best way to produce objectivity, nor that objectivity is the best thing to have, nor that objectivity constitutes either the best path or a conflated version of rationality. The beef then that I have with the situation that I am going to address is that for people who are making some nations barbarians as outliers, they insist that there is only one mode of classification by which one can achieve a task in a humane way. That is to produce a certain kind of formal classification scheme which allows you to be objective. And when you're objective, you're rational. And if you're rational, you will produce rational outcomes. And only a rational outcome produced in this manner is trustworthy. Now, you may do all kinds of good things by discretion, but discretion collapses into the arbitrary unless you can say, I did it by these rules, these standards, this criteria, and this guy who I am going to stick a needle in fits into this category after all is said and done. Well, it's the all is said and done that constitutes the mode of classification for disciplining to make sure that I feel good or I feel properly bad about sticking the needle in Joe Blow, who killed Sally Sue and her mother Betty and the baby and the dog and possibly the horse. I draw the line at the horse. There can be no reason for killing that horse. Is everybody hearing me, or I have to always say okay. So then I take the position, as Bruce Lincoln takes, in saying that, and I'm told to read my quote slowly, so I will do so. Bruce Lincoln argues that for all the epistemological functions of taxonomy, I'll start over. For all that the epistemological functions of taxonomy are undeniable, placing primary emphasis on them obscures the fact that all knowers are themselves objects of knowledge as well as subjects, insofar as they cannot and do not stand apart from the world that they seek to know. One consequence of which is that categorizers come to be categorized according to their own categories. Taxonomy is thus not only a means for organizing information, but also, as it comes to organize the organizers, an instrument for the classification and manipulation of society. Something that is particularly facilitated by the fashion in which taxonomic trees and binary oppositions can conveniently recode social history. Social hierarchies. And I began in thinking about Bruce Lincoln by thinking back to Horkheimer. And in the pre-war years, Horkheimer had already begun to argue that we are learning in the social sciences and in policy making as policymakers adopt social science to substitute formal classification schemes for down and dirty involvement with problems. If we can say that the classification scheme produces X outcome, we think we solved the problem. So, Joe Blow is equally dead, but It's okay because we classified him properly before we killed him. Thus, formal classification is what I'm really targeting here. Not classification generally. Like I said, we all do that. We all must do that. But a formal classification scheme is a different kind of beast. And it is a beast and a very predatory one. But even that I'm not arguing with here. Not all formal classification schemes are equally bestial. I am speaking instead of a particular mode of classification that continually depends on producing opposition, and then believing that the oppositions are in fact opposite, and therefore mutually exclusive, running into the fact that, oh gee, there's an overlap here. So I produce first a catch-all category. All you exception to the rule things fall over here. When you all become too preponderant, I create another category. And so I continually divide my categories and divide my categories. And I produce then homogeneity of the heterogeneous stuff with which I start. But as I get too much heterogeneity into my taxonomic structure, I have to then produce a homogeneous taxonomy for my taxonomic heterogeneity. Okay? So then I must lump where I split, and split again where I lump. Now Bowser and Starr see this as a problem that has to do with the preferences of individuals. That can give us a personality test, or you're a lumper or a splitter. No, within this dynamic, after a certain point, in order to do battle intellectually, you must lump or split. You must turn a heterogeneity into a homogeneity, or vice versa, depending on where you are in the process. What then does this have to do with the death penalty, Constitution, Human Rights Convention, and weak and strong state, or however we want to define the state? It is precisely this. If you do not have the proper classification system as a mode of classification that allows you to produce the right forms of personhood, whether that is the authorities that carry out the continuum of tasks, or the object, also known as people, against whom they carry out these tasks, or the people for whom they carry out these tasks, sometimes homogeneously known as one unit society, or more often, victims. And these then constitute hierarchies. You have the aggrieved, as those people who were victimized but you didn't kill them. Then you have families of the victims who are the aggrieved bereaved, but they all lump together as victims. But you also have, just take one example, the wrongfully convicted. This sucker spent 21 years on death row, didn't do anything. Well, is he a victim? A victim of what? Well, he is a victim of state-sanctioned killing. Well, can he fit into the same category as the other victims without changing the moral valence of the category? No. So, what you have to do then is try to think, well, how can I expand the core attributes of the concept victim in order that it will cover the array of pain and suffering that I want to fit under this concept? So you end up literally with battles at the microphone. And I was back and watched the battle at the microphone. Who gets to speak in the moral space created by the concept victim? And how does that continually divide up, separate, and reconstitute the core attributes of whatever is going to be called victim? And the fights become literal. Someone stands there and says, well, you get to speak now. And there are 5 other people waiting. But they're not just 5 people. One of them is the mother of a murdered child. The other one is the mother of a child, or is that an adult, about to be executed. One is the sister of a murdered person for whom no criminal has been found. We could go on and on. Who gets the money? So I look then at the fact that you now have to divide victim not merely by the core attributes that you constitute it, but you've got to drag in some other concept. perhaps kicking and screaming, but you drag in. So, child plus parent plus murder constitutes a compound that has priority as victim. This is the process then that I'm talking about. So if you are not engaged in that process and you have a death penalty, what happens? I take the case of Barbados. First I want to set up a quick contrast, but I'm not going to talk about Puerto Rico, but I want to set up a contrast. Now here in Puerto Rico, it is a constitutional entity, which I will call from now on a governing unit. It has a constitution, and in that constitution, it has a vision of the society it wants to create in relationship to the death penalty. It's very simple. It says, the death penalty shall not exist here. Now, you can slice and dice it any way you want. You have definitional battles that always precede any other form of concept. But that's pretty clear. We don't want it here. 80% of the population, by any poll still being conducted, is fine. Yeah, we got a lot of crime, we got all this stuff, but yeah, we'll stick with that constitutional provision. Does not matter. Because while Puerto Rico is a constitutional government, it has its own constitution, and as of 1927 included this provision in it, it is also subordinate to the United States, which in abolitionist language is a full retentionist state. Now what is a full retentionist state? A classificatory language. That is one that kills for ordinary and extraordinary crimes. Now that means that there are retentionist states that kill only for extraordinary crimes. So you got your split. And then there are states that are abolitionist states. Fully abolitionist states, of course, don't kill for either ordinary or extraordinary crimes. You got your two there as well. But since you're interested in figuring out how to measure progress by classification, you create another category called abolitionists in practice. Now, that is a retention state that still has a law on the books that says it can execute its citizens, but it hasn't done so recently. Now, recently can be as 3 years, 5 years. You get them into the dormancy category. Puerto Rico, though not a nation state, a constitutional territory, is dormant. So says the classification system. But as part of the big United States retentionist for all categories, it is subject to over 200 ways to be eliminated because the federal statute applies to the territory. So Puerto Rico has been slowly creeping toward the execution of one of its citizens. But it won't have to do it itself, because there's no execution chamber in Puerto Rico, so they'll just send them over to the states and we'll slice and dice them, and we don't care. We've got 40 jurisdictions in which, we could plan. So that's what I mean then about constitutional power. When they decided then that there are 120 countries, and they use the word countries, that are progressive, they don't have the death penalty, either in law or they have it in law, but they don't practice it. And you can expand that category a little bit more by saying, well, they have it in law, they haven't practiced it recently, and the leading politicians stood up and said, we're really going to get rid of this thing. We don't like it, and, we've got it on hold, and, we're going to fade it out. But they're going to fade it out. So you expand the category a little bit more. Anyway, you do all that, and you've got 120 progressive countries, and then these barbarians. Now, barbarians in the classificated world are outliers. They're people who don't fit the classification scheme. But in this instance, they're double outliers. They don't fit the classification scheme, and they do not use the mode of classification they would need to use in order to fit the classification scheme. Puerto Rico, then, is not an outlier in that sense. It is not only absorbed in, but even though it says the death penalty shall not exist here, it is sucked into the bifurcating process, and as it goes through these cases, it's learning the two-pronged dance. You have aggravators on the one hand, and the aggravators tell you just how bad you've been when you kill somebody. Then you have mitigators on the other side. Now, this splits immediately into statutory and non-statutory. A statutory mitigator is one that is preemptive. Let's call it a preemptive strike. It eliminates you. It says, even if you qualify by one of the many aggravators that may exist in a particular jurisdictional scheme, we can't sentence you to death. Because of some reason, okay? One typical one that's easy to understand is age. But we all know that age is a sliding scale. So what age? Until 2001, it was 15 and under. And so you could get a peculiar thing like in Arizona where it was 15 and under because the federal constitution said you couldn't kill them younger than that. But we limited it just a little bit by saying, well, 15, but you killed somebody who was 5 years older than you or 5 years younger than you. Now, I can't play this out for you, but just imagine 2 points coming together. So here you have 15, and then you have this one sliding over. The end result was you had about 16 months of childhood in Arizona before you were qualified to be sliced and diced on one end of that or the other. Now, I'm not making fun of my home state. That's the way classification works. 1961, Leach told us that. It's the biggest problem with it is that once the motor gets going for subtypes and subtypes of subtypes, it's unlimited. He charged us with butterfly collecting when we were studying kinship. Well, if for the death penalty is butterfly collecting, we pin the suckers to the wall, stick a needle right through them, and they are history. But we like history, so no problem. No problem at all. Now I'm going to find my place, and then I'll say something else here. All right. So we have these outliers that are doubly in abortion. I gave you Puerto Rico as an example of being sort of in and sort of out. I want to take Barbados, though, as the central case tonight. Barbados is a small state. It became an ex-colony in 1966. Before that, it had a death penalty that was controlled by the United Kingdom. And so when England abolished the death penalty, in the year that Barbados became independent, Barbados retained the old death penalty that the English had given up. They also retained the mode of classification, and therein lies their problem. Their constitution says, with slight modification of the British wording, it says anyone charged and convicted of murder shall be killed as a felon. Now, all Barbados did was remove shall be killed as a felon. Just said shall be killed. Simplify, you shall be killed. I mean, everybody knows you're a felon. You can kill people for misdemeanor. I mean, that crime says that you committed a crime like walking across the street against the light. And kill people for that. Unless you're in the car out of control, we don't normally kill people for that. So Barbados inherits and keeps a death penalty. It inherits and keeps an old mode of classification. It says only murder and only one sentence. It didn't slice and dice murder. It didn't go to first degree, second degree, manslaughter, vehicular murder, murder in defense of your great-grandmother who was crossing the street at high noon. It didn't go for any of that, although it recognized the degrees of reprehensibility attached to ways